the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be acceptable unto you, O Lord. I remember when I was very young, not too young, maybe I was like 5, 6, 7, my dad told me that if I was to read the entire Bible, I would get $5. And for some reason, I figured that that was a pretty solid deal. I read through the Bible, and I got $5. But I also didn't gain a lot of understanding about what the heck it was I just read, because, I mean, if you read the Bible with no information attached to it, you get a bunch of laws, you get a bunch of stories, you get things that don't make sense. Honestly, the things that really bugged me were the genealogies. Do I really need to know that this guy was related to this guy, this guy, this guy, or that this guy lived how many, like 900 years? Do I really need to know that sort of stuff? There's so much information in the Bible, and some of it is historical, and some of it is spiritual. And I think that that is the thing that really is hard for us to wrap our heads around when it comes to the Bible. When it comes to a story like the feeding of the 5,000, there is some of it that is historical, and there's some of it that is spiritual. And it's important when we're balancing out these two dual realities in the Bible, for us to ask ourselves, well, what is it that these stories are trying to teach us? See, the thing I wish I understood when I first read through the Bible is that the Bible isn't necessarily trying to tell you exactly what you should do with your life. It's trying to give you a framework in which you can understand how to be a good person within the world. And it's doing that by sharing these different perspectives that people have about how you do that. The feeding of the 5,000 is definitely considered to be one of Jesus' greatest hits. This is taking place during the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus had, as we've been reading, Jesus' ministry in Galilee has been all about sharing and providing and looking after your neighbor. And so this is all coming to sort of the culmination of that, where he tells the people in the crowd, blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the poor. Let's put the last first and the first last. And I think that context, that historical context, is important for us to understand this miracle. But I think we also need to pay attention to what the spiritual message we are getting here is. I very much listen to people the people who put forward that historical message. And they say that, well, the reason Jesus was able to feed all these people is because there was food in the crowd. And I see where they're coming from with that. And in large part, I believe it. I believe that that's probably what historically happened. That when Jesus was faced with all those people, he found some food, he sat everybody down. The Gospel of Mark, for instance, tells us that everybody was facing each other in a group. They could see who had and who did not. And that those who were in the crowd who had food shared. I can understand that, and I think that there is an important message in that, but I also think that when the gospel authors tell us that a miracle happened, that you can equate this to what Elijah did, I think that they're not lying to us either. I think that it is very important for us to understand that the reason why all 4 of the Gospels share us the story in this way is because they want to share with us a very important spiritual message. And that spiritual message is what you think is impossible can be made possible when you let God into the picture. If you think that feeding 5,000 people is like somebody asking you to walk on water, let God trickle into the picture. And let's see what happens. See, the reason why I don't have a problem with the historical approach to this is because I think it speaks to us to that spiritual message. I think it adds to the spiritual message. Yes, I can see God working through each and every one of us when we let generosity and love, when we let the teachings of Jesus Christ into our hearts, then that can compel us to work towards a miracle, even if we don't believe it. But I also think that sometimes we do need to open ourselves up to that spiritual force that will give us a little bit of strength to push. Excuse me, I apologize for that. That went in your direction. To push against our doubts, to step out of the boat in the middle of the storm and to see whether or not we can walk on water. I don't believe that the gospel authors were lying to us in trying to, because in each of the narrative accounts, nobody tells us exactly what happened. They tell us that the food goes out into the crowd and more food comes back. I've heard a lot of people say, well, the gospel authors have an agenda. And I've shared with you that I'm aware of that. That is true. The Gospel of John, for instance, had an agenda. It wanted to distinguish Christianity as its own thing, sometimes at the detriment of people who worshipped Jewish in the Jewish temple tradition. But I really do think that the gospel authors are just sharing us, at this point in time, one of Jesus' greatest hits. And at this point within the Christian culture, the way people looked at Jesus as a figure who was blessed, who spoke the will of God as Elijah did. And so I think that the spiritual message that I get from this passage is that we are living in a world where we are faced with a lot of adversity. We are faced with the stark reality of that seems like 5,000 people asking for food. What do we do about climate change? What can we do? It seems like no matter how much we are aware of it or made aware of it, we continue to feed into those bad habits that seem to ruin our planet. Well, I think sometimes we need to put a little bit of faith into we need to put a little bit of faith and let God into the picture, because even if it doesn't seem like we're making an impact, or at least enough of an impact, I don't think that's a reason to stop trying to make positive change in the world. As we get closer and closer to an election, as people feel more and more nervous and anxious about where our country is going, honestly, I find myself thinking, okay, I gotta let God into the picture. I gotta have faith and just keep pushing for what I feel is right. As we work to deal with issues in our own communities around poverty, when we look at issues of social or racial justice, and we don't see things going in the direction in which we want, when we look at things like a woman's right a woman's right to choose, when we look at these things in our society and we see the world pushing back in us in a way that makes us want to give up hope, this passage tells us, keep trying. Don't give up hope. Have a little bit of faith that you can walk on water if you are willing to step out of the boat. Because very often when we feel like things are hopeless, we are less likely to take action, the type of action that is needed in order to change the story, to turn the page, to shift the narrative. If we are not willing to accept that we have a responsibility to be the people that change the way in which the conversation is going, to change the way in which we think about these issues, to step up to the plate and to try to do good, then who is? Jesus tells us that there is a tremendous power when we come together to try to do good in the world. The reason why I believe in the historical message that a lot of scholars tell us about the feeding of the 5,000 is because I think that it adds to that spiritual message, that when we come together and pool our love, it can make change in ways that are surprising. But the reason why I also trust in the message of the gospel authors who tell us this is Elijah at work is because sometimes you really need God to give you a kick in the butt to do something good in the world. And I think that both of those messages are valuable. And I think that if we are not willing to understand the dual messaging that we often get in the Bible, sometimes we can miss some of those important messages that give us good advice about how to be good people within the world. I think that too often when we read through this passage, we get that spiritual, we just get the spiritual stuff. We don't get the historical stuff. And that's fine. I think the spiritual message is the important one here. But I also think that it's important for us to ask, is there anything else going on in these passages that can help us ground this in our lives? And that's, I feel, is the most important part of the Bible. How do we ground this in our lives? Because Jesus didn't come to us to tell us how we can be perfect angels in heaven. Jesus came to us to tell us how we can be good children of God here on earth. Amen.